Hey everyone! Tonight we're diving into the elegant, disciplined, and often brutally unforgiving world of feudal Japan. It was a place of samurai honor, incredibly strict rules, and consequences that could be, well, rather permanent. It's a land famed for its cherry blossoms, its beautiful poetry, but also a daily grind that would likely leave most of us completely exhausted before lunchtime. So, before you settle in too comfortably, I just want to ask you to take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from all corners of the globe. Now go ahead and dim the lights, maybe even turn on a fan for that nice, soft background hum. Let's all ease into tonight's adventure together. In feudal Japan, you don't exactly wake up and decide what you want to be. You wake up and your path has pretty much already been determined for you by your birth, by your bloodline, and by decisions made by people who've been dead for like 6 generations. Your role in society isn't a suggestion. It's more like a life sentence. Born into a samurai family? Well, aren't you lucky? You're now responsible for mastering the blade, the bow, and about 10,000 different ways to sit properly in front of your lord without fidgeting. Born a peasant? Congratulations. You'll be spending the next 4 decades with your ankles deep in mud. And your children will too, for the foreseeable future. There's no resume. There's no starting your own business. You're either a samurai, a peasant, an artisan, or a merchant. And once you've been placed into one of these categories, you pretty much stay there. Trying to jump ranks isn't just looked down upon. It's actually punishable by law. You don't climb the social ladder in feudal Japan. You bow to it. In modern life, you're told to follow your dreams, be your own person, and live your truth. In feudal Japan, your truth is whatever your clan actually tells you it is. Individualism isn't a virtue. It's a huge red flag. You exist not as some lone star of destiny, but as a very small branch on a very important family tree. And your job is to keep that tree from catching fire due to any embarrassing behavior, like expressing opinions or falling in love with a merchant's daughter. Your clan is everything. Your identity, your reputation, your future. It all flows directly through your family name. You are actually part of a web of obligations, honor, and expectations that's so dense it might as well just be a spiritual spreadsheet. Even the samurai, those proud, honorable warriors, don't fight for themselves. They fight for their daimyo, their household, their ancestors. And if they happen to die, ideally, it's in a way that makes everyone above them look absolutely great. Because dying with honor is definitely one thing, but dying in a way that even slightly embarrasses your clan, that's the stuff of generational nightmares. Your actions reflect on your father. Your father's actions reflect on your grandfather. Your grandfather's actions may still be affecting how your cousin is treated in the next province over. It's not just guilt by association. It's pretty much life by association. Want to open a noodle shop because you absolutely love cooking? That's adorable. Unfortunately, your clan actually raises horses, so you'll be brushing hooves until further notice. Express interest in painting? Excellent. You'll be decorating the temple that your family sponsors with incredibly strict guidelines and in total silence. And don't even think about scandal. One poorly timed affair, a drunken incident, or a public poem with just a little too much sass, and the shame hits everyone. Your siblings are shunned. Your mother is mortified. Now, back on land, licking the wounds of defeat, the Persian war machine had to change its plans. And in a rare moment of genuine trust, Xerxes turned once again to Artemisia, not as a novelty, but as his most reliable advisor. He asked her a deeply personal question. What should he do next? Artemisia, ever blunt, told him exactly what no proud emperor wanted to hear. Retreat. She urged him to return to Persia and leave his trusted general Mardonius in charge of the remaining campaign in Greece. You've achieved what you needed. Athens has burned. Don't push your luck, was essentially her message. And incredibly, Xerxes listened. The man who had ignored most of his war counsel followed the advice of a single woman. It was a moment that confirmed what others had only suspected. Artemisia wasn't just brave. She was politically lethal. She knew when to fight, when to deceive, and now when to walk away. Her power didn't come from brute force. It came from clarity, something in short supply among kings and conquerors. In the aftermath, she was entrusted with the guardianship of Xerxes' sons, an honor that spoke volumes. In ancient courts, you didn't hand over your heirs to just anyone. You chose someone whose loyalty was unquestionable and whose judgment could be trusted. Artemisia, a woman born on the fringes of empire, had now placed herself right at its heart. Back in Halicarnassus, she returned not as a queen uncertain of her place, but as a figure of undeniable consequence. Her legend began to take root. She wasn't just a ruler anymore. She was the woman who stood face to face with empires and didn't even blink. Where most would have sought safety and silence, Artemisia had stepped into war and somehow came back even more powerful than when she left. These weren't bedtime stories. They were raw data, line after line of celestial movements, detailing when Venus would rise, how long it would shine, and when a solar eclipse might strike. These tablets were essentially the world's first almanacs. The most remarkable part is that they could predict lunar eclipses using a pattern known as the Saros cycle, a period of roughly 18 years after which eclipses repeat. They didn't understand why it worked, but they knew it did work, and that was enough. For a culture that fused divination with astronomy, being able to foresee cosmic events gave them enormous power, both spiritual and political. And while the Greeks are often credited with inventing the zodiac, the truth is the Babylonians got there first. They divided the sky into 12 equal parts, each anchored to a constellation, and laid the foundation for what would become the zodiac signs we still use and misuse today. Yes, when someone asks your sign, you can thank Babylon. But what really sets the Babylonians apart is their mathematical boldness. They tracked planetary motion, even retrograde paths, and used arithmetic methods to approximate celestial cycles. Not geometric models, mind you, that would come later with the Greeks, but arithmetic that worked. And for practical purposes, that was more than enough. They saw the universe as a ledger of patterns, a giant machine of repeating cycles. And their astronomers were not just mystics or priests. They were early scientists, hunched over tablets, decoding the rhythms of the cosmos in symbols and numbers. In the dark, they wrote the sky. While the Babylonians were busy predicting eclipses, the ancient Egyptians were sinking their entire civilization into the stars. Quite literally. In the Nile Valley, astronomy wasn't just a curiosity. It was survival. And at the heart of it all was a single star, Sirius, the brightest light in the night sky. The Egyptians noticed something extraordinary. Things hadn't started out this way. Just a few years prior, France had secretly acquired Louisiana from Spain under the Treaty of San Ildefonso. Napoleon harbored grand ambitions of restoring a French colonial empire. Louisiana was intended to supply Saint-Domingue, the crown jewel of France's Caribbean colonies, now known as Haiti, with essential wheat, meat, and other provisions. France didn't desire Louisiana for its own intrinsic value. It needed it to support its sugar production. However, that vision was consumed by fire and fever. The Haitian Revolution, led by formerly enslaved people under the guidance of leaders like Toussaint Louverture, had erupted into a full-blown rebellion. France dispatched tens of thousands of troops to quell the uprising, only to witness them succumb to disease and battle by the thousands. Napoleon lost his most capable general, his army, and his chance to reclaim the wealthiest sugar colony on earth. With Saint-Domingue slipping from his grasp, Louisiana became irrelevant, even a liability. It was now indefensible, and with Britain poised to launch another war against France, Napoleon feared that Louisiana might be seized by force. So, instead of fighting to retain it, he chose to sell it. In typical Napoleonic fashion, the decision was swift, bold, and utterly pragmatic. On April 11, 1803, he astonished American diplomats Robert Livingston and James Monroe with an offer: the entire Louisiana Territory, not just New Orleans, for a mere $15 million. Napoleon's rationale was straightforward. I have given England a maritime rival that will sooner or later humble her pride. He sought more than just money. He wanted the United States to grow strong enough to challenge Britain. Selling Louisiana wasn't a surrender. It was a strategic maneuver. And so, in a single act, Napoleon abandoned his American empire and forever altered the destiny of a country he barely respected. And we haven't even gotten to the Ada yet, the untouchables. These are the people who deal with death. Butchers, executioners, leather workers. Society needs them, sure, but pretends they don't even exist. They're like ghosts with jobs. Important jobs, but ghosts nonetheless. Even within these classes, things get even more complicated. Let's say you're a merchant, which actually sounds pretty decent, right? You've got some coin. But in feudal Japan, you're practically near the bottom of the barrel. And why is that? Well, it's because you make money without actually doing any physical labor, which is considered, shall we say, morally questionable. Yes, you're literally considered too efficient to be respected. Meanwhile, the peasants are taxed so heavily on their rice that if they cough up too much, they actually starve. But if they try to hide some rice to survive, that's considered treason. Heads roll often. Samurai, you've got honor, sure, but you're living in constant fear of accidentally disrespecting your lord, your ancestors, your tailor, or your sword, maybe even by just accidentally sneezing at the wrong time. Women, well, nobody even asked you what you thought about any of this. But no, you're definitely not getting out of this either. Whatever your social class, your personal freedom ends precisely where your father's opinions begin. You'll marry whomever you're told to, obey whomever you must, and thank all the heavens if you're even allowed to learn poetry. So yes, you're essentially born, assigned a costume and a script, and then shoved right onto the stage of society whether you actually want to perform or not. It's elegant, it's poetic, and it's crushingly inescapable. And that's all before you've even had breakfast. Now, you might think that feudal life was all grit and grime, but Japan actually took cleanliness pretty seriously, almost painfully seriously. Your great-uncle might actually have to disembowel himself just to restore the family's good standing. You are not a person. You are a representative, a chess piece, and also a liability with legs. But hey, if you play your role well, bow at the right times, and marry whomever you're told to, your clan might just speak your name with something resembling pride. And that's pretty much the feudal Japanese version of a personal achievement badge. Let's say that you've somehow survived the social hierarchy, the sword duels, the honor system, and the rice tax. Congratulations. Now try surviving the weather. Feudal Japan is an absolute masterpiece of natural beauty. Snow-capped mountains, serene forests, blooming cherry blossoms, and also an absolute nightmare of environmental chaos. The scenery is absolutely gorgeous. The climate just wants you dead. Start with the typhoons. Massive storms that arrive like angry gods, bringing rain, wind, and basically destroying the structural integrity of a rice paper wall. Roofs fly off. Roads completely vanish. The rice that you spent all season planting is floating gently downstream. Then there are the earthquakes, sudden, violent, and completely unpredictable. There's no warning siren, no alert system, just a very faint rumble, a brief moment of existential confusion, and then your house is sideways. If you somehow survive the shaking, you still have to worry about fires because everything is made of wood, including your bad decisions. Flooding is also common. Too much rain and the rivers just swell. Your village becomes a muddy soup bowl. Your crops drown. Your animals just wander off. Your landlord still wants his taxes, of course, now with interest. Droughts are just as cruel. Weeks of punishing sun and no rain leave the land completely cracked and the rice fields as dry as a monk's humor. You pray to the gods. You do rituals. You start eyeing your neighbor's well with deep suspicion. While Artemisia's military accomplishments earned her notoriety, her legacy wasn't built solely on the battlefield. It also thrived in the minds of those who wrote about it, especially in the writings of Herodotus, the so-called father of history, who just so happened to be born in Halicarnassus, the very city that Artemisia ruled. This geographic coincidence added an almost eerie sense of intimacy to his account of her life. He wasn't writing about some distant myth. He was writing about his queen. And yet, Herodotus didn't portray her as a simple caricature of feminine virtue or villainy. He painted her as something much rarer in historical records. A competent, calculating, and compelling leader. His account of the Battle of Salamis highlights not only her courage but also her cold pragmatism. The sinking of the Allied ship, the escape under Greek confusion, the brutal brilliance of it all. In Herodotus' work, Artemisia becomes more than just a commander. she becomes a paradox, both admired and feared, respected and suspected. But make no mistake, that respect was hard-earned. She existed in the shadow of men, powerful men like Xerxes and Mardonius, but somehow she outshone them all. While they drowned in ambition, she stayed afloat through foresight. She knew when to fight and when to disappear. That kind of wisdom is rare, and it's even rarer when it comes from a woman in a world that equated femininity with fragility. And perhaps that's what intrigued Herodotus the most. Artemisia didn't fit in, not in the cultural norms of her time, and certainly not in the neat categories that historians like to create. She wasn't a rebel, but she disobeyed. She wasn't a feminist because the concept didn't exist, but she undermined patriarchy through her sheer competence alone. Her legacy spread quietly, not through monuments or golden statues, but through stories, echoes passed along by men who were forced to admit that she was better than them. Each year, just before the annual flooding of the Nile, Sirius would reappear on the horizon at dawn. This event, known as the heliacal rising of Sirius, became the cornerstone of their calendar. That wasn't just poetic. It was vital. The Nile's floodwaters determined crop cycles, and missing that window could mean famine. So, the Egyptians created a 365-day solar calendar, divided into 12 months of 30 days, plus 5 festival days. It was remarkably close to our modern calendar, centuries before Julius Caesar ever got involved. But the Egyptians didn't stop with Sirius. They tracked the sun, moon, and stars from their temples, many of which were aligned with astonishing astronomical precision. The Temple of Karnak, for instance, was oriented so that the sun would rise directly through its axis during the summer solstice. Other temples lined up with the rising and setting of stars considered sacred. And then there were the pyramids. The Great Pyramid of Giza, constructed around 2560 B.C.E., was aligned almost perfectly with the cardinal points. Its shafts may have been pointed toward specific stars, possibly Orion and Sirius, hinting at a celestial connection between the heavens and the pharaoh's journey into the afterlife. This wasn't just burial architecture. It was cosmological engineering. Egyptian priests often served double duty as astronomers. They observed the skies not only for ritual timing, but for signs, omens, and the will of the gods. Astronomy, theology, and governance were tightly interwoven. To rule Egypt was to understand the sky. What's remarkable is that, without telescopes, without even lenses, they developed an entire system for tracking time, orienting buildings, and forecasting natural events, all based on patient observation and relentless precision. The Egyptians didn't look at the sky for entertainment. They looked up and saw a divine clock ticking with purpose, echoing eternity. What he considered a mere imperial afterthought would become the launching pad for America's westward expansion and the beginning of the end for Native American sovereignty across the continent. Thomas Jefferson had long envisioned an agrarian republic, a nation of independent farmers living on their own land, united by liberty and civic virtue. The Louisiana Purchase should have been the realization of his dreams, but instead, it presented him with a constitutional dilemma. Jefferson was a strict constructionist, believing that the federal government should only exercise powers explicitly granted by the Constitution. And nowhere in that document did it authorize the U.S. government to purchase foreign territory. There was no clause for acquiring an entire continent, no legal precedent for doubling the nation's size in a single transaction. As a result, Jefferson hesitated. Napoleon's offer seemed too good to be true. $15 million for land stretching from the Mississippi to the Rocky Mountains. It was a once-in-a-civilization opportunity, but Jefferson wrestled with the inherent contradiction. Could he, a man who feared federal overreach, stretch the Constitution to justify such a massive acquisition? In private, he even considered proposing a constitutional amendment to authorize the purchase. But time was of the essence, and political realities loomed. If he delayed, Napoleon might change his mind, or Britain might seize the territory before the ink could dry. So Jefferson made an ironic decision. He embraced implied powers, the very concept he had criticized Alexander Hamilton for advocating years earlier. He justified the purchase as a treaty, which the Constitution did allow the president to make with Senate approval. The Senate ratified the deal in October 1803 with overwhelming support, and Jefferson, while privately uneasy, defended his decision as necessary for the survival and security of the Republic. In fact, it was practically a religion, which sounds absolutely lovely until you actually experience it in the middle of winter. You begin your day by washing, but not in some cozy, tiled bathroom with a warm towel and cucumber soap. No, you wash at a stone basin filled with ice-cold water that you've fetched from a well or stream. There's no heating. There's absolutely no negotiating. You splash your face and arms, shivering so hard it feels like your ancestors are punishing you for even having pores. Soap is only available if you're incredibly rich. And even then, it's probably made from ash or rice bran, and it smells like something a monk invented specifically as a test of your character. In the rural areas, the local bathhouse, if you're lucky enough to even have one, becomes the real heart of hygiene. This communal center is heated by firewood and filled with villagers. And by communal, we mean absolutely no privacy whatsoever. You bathe right next to your neighbors, your boss, your future in-laws, and maybe even your landlord, completely naked and in total silence, all while pretending that this isn't incredibly awkward. You scrub first, then you soak. Cleanliness is sacred. Dirtying the bath water? Social suicide. But if you don't happen to live near a bathhouse, then you just wash what you can when you can. You clean your teeth with salt or maybe a twig. Your nails are kept neat. Your clothes are regularly aired out. You do this not because it's trendy, but because being unclean is seen as shameful, both spiritually and socially. And if you happen to be a samurai, you can multiply that pressure tenfold. Your lord might inspect you from head to toe at any given moment. Dirty fingernails? Dishonor. Wrinkled robe? Disrespect. Too much body odor during a bow. You might not even get back up again. Women are expected to smell like cherry blossoms and pure discipline. Bathing is ritualized. And then there's winter. Not some snowy wonderland, but more like bone-deep cold, thin blankets, and fires that burn out well before midnight. Heating isn't central. It's just communal suffering. You rub your hands together over a small clay heater, hoping that frostbite doesn't become the latest trend this year. Even volcanoes occasionally want to get in on the action. Japan is located within the Ring of Fire, and yes, it's about as exciting as it sounds. Eruptions could cover entire areas with ash, lava, or the embarrassing realization that your sacred shrine is now a rock garden. There's no FEMA or national relief effort to help you out. If your house falls apart, you rebuild it yourself. If your food spoils, you go hungry. And if your lord's estate is also affected by the disaster, well, you're still required to pay your taxes. After all, a disaster isn't a valid excuse to skip out on your financial obligations. In feudal Japan, nature isn't just a pretty backdrop. It's a constant reminder that even the gods themselves might be having a rough day. In feudal Japan, power flows downward, and so do responsibilities, expectations, and blame. Think you're a big shot? Think again. There's always someone higher up the ladder than you. Let's say you're a peasant. Your life is controlled by the village headman, who answers to the local samurai, who answers to the daimyo, who answers to the shogun, who might even whisper something to the emperor, who doesn't really rule as much as haunt the capital in fancy robes. Even the samurai, those fierce, sword-wielding enforcers of justice, aren't at the top of the food chain. They spend their lives serving a lord, waiting for orders, and sometimes fighting in battles they didn't start, over land they don't own, for glory they'll never personally experience. In theory, they're honored. In reality, they're just well-dressed middle management with a katana sword. In war councils, she outsmarted them. In battle, she outmaneuvered them. And in politics, she outlasted them. For all their noise, the men of her time ended up needing scribes to keep their memories alive. Artemisia had something better, a story that refused to be forgotten. As Herodotus put down his scroll and dipped his pen again, he wasn't just writing history. He was recording a riddle in the shape of a queen. Strangely enough, the name Artemisia didn't disappear after her death. About a century later, it reappeared, this time in the form of another queen, Artemisia II of Curia, a namesake and likely descendant who also ruled Halicarnassus. But while the second Artemisia never commanded fleets in battle, she, too, would carve her name into the very fabric of history, quite literally. Her claim to fame, building one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the mausoleum at Halicarnassus. The second Artemisia commissioned this towering marble tomb for her husband, Mausolus, who was also her brother, because ancient dynastic politics never failed to get awkward. But it wasn't just a tribute to grief. It was a statement, a monument to Carian identity, and an echo of the power that the first Artemisia had once wielded. Historians have long debated whether the two women were directly related, mother and daughter, aunt and niece, or possibly not related at all. But one thing is clear. The name Artemisia had, by then, become synonymous with power, intellect, and bold rule. The legacy of the original queen had seeped so deeply into the identity of Halicarnassus that future generations wore it like armor. Even more fascinating is how the second Artemisia's mausoleum gave us the very word we use today for monumental tombs. Mausoleum, a linguistic legacy born from stone, grief, and political theater. Deep in the jungles of Mesoamerica, long before Europeans set foot in the New World, the Maya were building one of the most sophisticated astronomical systems the world had ever seen. Without metal tools, without wheels, and without telescopes, they mapped the movements of the sun, moon, planets, and stars with a precision that still baffles modern scholars. To the Maya, astronomy was not a luxury of the learned elite. It was the framework of society itself. Their rulers were seen as cosmic intermediaries, and every major political or religious event was timed to match a celestial counterpart. Eclipses, solstices, equinoxes, and Venus cycles weren't just observed. They were used to legitimize power. One of their most striking achievements was their tracking of Venus. The Maya noted that Venus disappeared and reappeared in the sky in a repeating cycle of 584 days, and they tied this rhythm into their ritual warfare and calendar systems. The Dresden Codex, one of the few surviving pre-Columbian manuscripts, contains a Venus table that tracks the planet's movements over hundreds of years with an error of less than 1 day. They didn't stop there. The Maya developed the long count calendar, capable of tracking dates over spans of thousands of years. They understood the solar year with incredible accuracy, approximately 365, 2,420 days, remarkably close to the modern value. Their calendar systems were so refined that multiple ones ran simultaneously. The 260-day ritual calendar, Salkin, the 365-day solar calendar, Hab, and the long count for historical chronology. And the observatories, they didn't have glass domes, but they had stone genius. The El Caracol Observatory at Chichen Itza was built with specific windows and alignments that allowed Mayan priests to track the movements of Venus and the sun. Temple staircases and shadow effects were timed to equinoxes, like the famous serpent shadow that slithers down El Castillo during the spring and autumn. And just like that, Jefferson, the constitutional purist, became the architect of the largest peaceful land acquisition in U.S. history. The contradiction was not lost on his critics, who branded him a hypocrite. But Jefferson saw it as a necessary compromise, bending the Constitution, in his view, to preserve the Republic rather than destroy it. In doing so, he set a precedent. The federal government could acquire land by treaty, even without explicit constitutional authority. This precedent would be invoked repeatedly as the United States expanded further west and into territories already inhabited by others. The Louisiana Purchase had been signed, sealed, and ratified, but nobody truly knew what the U.S. had just bought. The land was vast, sparsely mapped, and filled with unknown rivers, mountains, species, and people. So, in 1804, President Jefferson commissioned an expedition that would become one of the most iconic journeys in American history. The Corps of Discovery, led by Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. Their mission was ambitious: explore the new territory, establish trade relations with Native American nations, study the land's resources, and, most importantly, discover a water route to the Pacific Ocean. Jefferson envisioned a Northwest Passage, a navigable link between the Atlantic and Pacific that would revolutionize trade. Spoiler alert, it didn't exist. But what Lewis and Clark found would still transform how Americans perceived their place on the continent. They embarked from St. Louis in May 1804 with a team of over 30 men, heading upriver into land untouched by American settlers. Along their journey, they documented over 100 new animal species and 178 new plants. They mapped rivers, sketched mountains, and meticulously kept journals filled with scientific and ethnographic observations. However, they didn't accomplish this alone. Skincare is practiced with military-level precision, and hair is maintained in elaborate styles that can take hours to complete. Also, you can work a rice mortar and still look dignified while doing it. So yes, feudal Japan was clean, very clean. But it definitely came at a steep price, freezing water, endless grooming, and the constant soul-shrinking awareness that someone was absolutely judging your foot hygiene. Okay, so let's say you were born into the warrior class, the samurai. Sounds pretty cool, right? Fancy swords, silk robes, dramatic sword fights underneath the cherry blossoms. Now, let's talk about the fine print. Being a samurai in feudal Japan isn't just about swinging a katana around and shouting about honor. It's about never, ever screwing up. The entire framework of your life is governed by Bushido, which is essentially the way of the warrior. It's a code of conduct that's so strict even your ancestors are a little nervous. You don't live for yourself. You live for your daimyo, your lord. His word is law. His moods are like weather patterns. And your job is to serve him with such unwavering loyalty that you'd honestly rather die horribly than even mildly disappoint him. No pressure at all, of course. Disobedience? Dishonor. Failure? Dishonor. Raising your voice inappropriately? Dishonor. Looking at the wrong person sideways during a tea ceremony? You guessed it, dishonor. And dishonor isn't something you just walk off. It's something you're expected to atone for, usually with your own intestines. And that's not a metaphor. That's seppuku, the ritual suicide that's expected of disgraced samurai. You kneel down, pull out a short blade, and, well, let's just stop right there. I think you get the idea. This wasn't rare either. It was actually a respected, even celebrated way to preserve your dignity. Mess up badly enough, and your lord might just give you a short blade and a quiet room and say, "You know what to do." The daimyo, those powerful lords who control provinces and armies, might seem untouchable until the shogun decides they're getting too ambitious. Then, all of a sudden, their castles are being inspected, their letters are being intercepted, and their heads are very gently removed from their political aspirations. Even the shogun, the military dictator, the most powerful man in Japan, has to keep an eye on the court, the clans, the economy, and at least 4 cousins who are trying to poison his tea. He rules, sure, but he doesn't get much sleep. Meanwhile, the emperor technically outranks everyone, but he has no real power. He's like a sacred artifact that you can't touch but also can't ignore. He blesses rituals, names, eras, and occasionally writes poetry. He's also probably broke. This hierarchy isn't flexible at all. You can't climb it. You're placed in a specific spot and you stay there like an overly obedient bonsai tree. Ambition isn't admired. It's feared. The higher you climb, the closer you get to a sword in your back. Respect is demanded from those below you, and authority is enforced on those above you. Orders are obeyed without question. Disagreements are dangerous, and any hint that you think you're better than your station is an ambition. It's a death wish in a fancy outfit. So, no matter who you are, peasant, merchant, samurai, or lord, someone above you controls your fate, and someone below you is hoping you mess up. In feudal Japan, what you learn, or even if you learn anything at all, depends entirely on where you are on the social ladder. Spoiler alert. If you're near the bottom, the ladder is mostly invisible and sometimes on fire. Let's start at the top. Samurai children. They're the lucky ones. From a young age, they're taught reading, writing, swordsmanship, etiquette, poetry, archery, horseback riding, and the ancient art of looking unimpressed at all times. A samurai boy learns how to write a death poem by the time he's 14. And while the second Artemisia was known for mourning, she was also a capable ruler, continuing the thread of female leadership in a corner of the ancient world where that was anything but normal. But let's not forget that the foundation for all of this was laid by the first Artemisia, the naval commander, the queen who advised Xerxes, the woman who navigated the Greek world as both an insider and an outsider. Without her, the name might have faded, and Halicarnassus might have been just another forgotten city on a forgotten coast. Instead, it became a beacon, a place where two powerful women shaped history, not through accident, but through audacity. Their stories, though separated by time, speak to each other across the centuries, one with ships, one with stone, and both with names that history could not quite bury. Artemisia's story has always lived in the in-between, between empires, between genders, and between legend and history. And nowhere is this more obvious than in the way her legacy has been argued, bent, and reinterpreted over the centuries. Was she a Persian puppet, a Greek traitor, or simply a sovereign playing chess while others were busy swinging swords? To the Persians, she was a loyal commander, one of the few who gave sound advice and fought with distinction. Xerxes clearly trusted her more than many of his seasoned generals, which, in itself, speaks volumes about her political sharpness and composure under pressure. In the Persian world, her loyalty was seen as honorable, perhaps even heroic. To the Greeks, it was more complicated. Many viewed her as a turncoat, someone who had betrayed her Hellenic roots to side with an Eastern power. And yet, even Greek chroniclers, notably Herodotus, couldn't help but admire her intelligence and cunning. In many ways, she was a mirror to their own contradictions, proving that not all Greeks stood with Greece and not all Persians were villains. She defied the lines that war tried to draw. The Maya weren't just watching the skies. They were synchronizing their civilization with them. Their kings ruled by the stars. Their temples rose in tune with solstices, and their wars were timed with the wanderings of Venus. They didn't just read the cosmos. They wove it into the fabric of life. In ancient China, astronomy wasn't simply a science. It was a matter of state. The emperor, regarded as the son of heaven, ruled with the mandate of heaven, a cosmic endorsement that could be revoked if the stars sent the wrong message. That made astronomy both sacred and political. If the sky changed, so could the dynasty. As early as 2000 BCE, Chinese astronomers were tracking celestial events and documenting them with methodical care. They recorded comets, novae, eclipses, sunspots, and planetary motions. Some of these records, like those found in the Shi records of the Grand Historian and the Book of Han, are still referenced by modern scientists today to verify ancient astronomical phenomena. Perhaps most remarkable is their documentation of a supernova explosion in 1054 CE, visible in daylight for 23 days. Chinese astronomers recorded its location with such accuracy that modern astronomers used the data to identify the remnants, now known as the Crab Nebula. But China's astronomical prowess didn't rely on mystical interpretation alone. They developed mechanical devices such as armillary spheres and gnomons, shadow-casting rods, to measure the altitude of the sun and the positions of stars. In fact, the Chinese had working water-powered celestial globes and astronomical clock centuries before Europe caught up. Chinese astronomers divided the sky into 28 lunar mansions, similar in concept to Western constellations, and used them for both navigation and timekeeping. They also created the Chinese lunisolar calendar, which balanced lunar months with the solar year and remains in use today to determine traditional holidays like the Lunar New Year. One of the most crucial figures on the expedition was Sacagawea, a young Shoshone woman who joined the group with her French-Canadian husband. Sacagawea was more than just a translator. She was a symbol of peace. Her presence, accompanied by her child, signaled to Native American tribes that this was not a war party. Her knowledge of geography and diplomacy helped the Corps survive dangerous crossings and forge essential alliances. Over 2 years, the expedition traveled more than 8,000 miles, relying on boats, horses, and their own 2 feet. They reached the Pacific Ocean in November 1805, constructed a fort for the winter, and returned east by 1806. They didn't find a Northwest Passage, but they brought back something arguably more valuable: a detailed account of the newly acquired land and the people who called it home. Jefferson had purchased a mystery. Lewis and Clark began to unravel it. But while their reports inspired dreams of westward expansion, they also foreshadowed something darker: the increasing pressure on indigenous nations and the inevitable drive toward conquest under the guise of discovery. To American politicians and settlers, the Louisiana Purchase was a land bonanza, a blank slate for farms, cities, and ambitious endeavors. But to the Native American nations who had lived there for centuries, it was something entirely different. The beginning of erasure. The land the U.S. had purchased from France was already home to over 50 sovereign indigenous nations, each with its own unique language, territory, and system of governance. From the Ojibwe and Sioux to the Cheyenne, Comanche, and Mandan, these communities had been managing the land, trading with one another, and forming alliances long before any European flag had been planted. But in the eyes of Jefferson and future U.S. leaders, the Louisiana Territory was a vast, underutilized canvas, ripe for American settlement. On top of all that, samurai were expected to train constantly. Swordsmanship, archery, horseback riding, strategy, calligraphy, poetry, all while maintaining absolutely perfect posture, and also the expression of a man who's never actually known joy, just a deep, abiding sense of obligation. Laughing too loudly is considered unrefined. Showing any fear or weakness is shameful. Getting emotional, shameful. Your clothes have to be precise, your sword must be spotless, and your overall conduct must be so honorable it makes everyone around you deeply uncomfortable. And if you ever raise your sword in anger without a proper cause, insult a superior, or just simply lose a duel, you don't just lose the duel, you lose absolutely everything. Being a samurai isn't about glory. It's about discipline, silence, and just surviving each and every day without blinking in the wrong way. So yes, you look amazing in that armor, but you're literally one eyebrow twitch away from existential catastrophe. So you weren't born a samurai. No sword, no poetry, no chance of dramatic ritual disembowelment. Well, that's the good news. The bad news? You're a peasant, which means your entire existence is pretty much a combination of dirt, sweat, back pain, and government-mandated rice delivery. You wake up with the sun, but not because you're all that one with nature. You wake up because the land tax doesn't pay itself. And also, your thatched hut has pretty much no doors, no windows, and someone's goat just walked across your bed mat. Breakfast, if you're lucky, is a bowl of rice porridge and maybe a side of last week's pickled something. If you're unlucky, you just pretend you're not actually hungry with a splash of river water. Then it's off to the rice fields, which might sound pretty peaceful in travel documentaries, but are, in reality, muddy pits designed to slowly break your soul over the course of 12 hours. You were probably just figuring out cursive at that age. Their education is rigorous, but it has a clear purpose: to serve, protect, and not embarrass the clan. They study Chinese classics, Bushido principles, and how to bow so perfectly that the gods themselves take notes. Then, there are merchant and artisan families. They get some education, usually math, record-keeping, and maybe a little reading, but only what's necessary for business. You're not reading Confucius. You're learning how to calculate the price of pickled turnips in bulk. Is it practical? Yes. Is it glorious? Not really. For peasant children, education looks something like this. This is a hoe. This is rice. Now start working before the sun beats us to it. Your parents teach you how to farm, how to survive, and how to politely not die in front of the tax collector. Literacy is rare. Schooling is a luxury. The only scroll you'll ever read is the one nailed to a tree explaining why your taxes just went up again. And what about girls? Unless you're from a high-ranking family, you don't get much formal education at all. You're taught domestic skills: sewing, etiquette, tea ceremonies, and how to be silent while managing a household. If you're really lucky, you might learn calligraphy or poetry, as long as it doesn't distract you from folding laundry with spiritual precision. Education in feudal Japan isn't about personal growth. It's about fulfilling your role without asking any questions. The idea of learning for fun would probably make most elders faint right into their sake cups. So, yes, knowledge is power, which is exactly why they kept it so tightly controlled. Feudal Japan is a land of stunning beauty. Everything, from the curve of a fan to the placement of a teacup, seems designed to soothe the soul and impress your ancestors. But here's the catch. You can and will be judged for doing it wrong. Culture in feudal Japan isn't just art. It's performance with consequences. And then there's the modern view, where historians and readers alike continue to wrestle with what she represents. A feminist icon before feminism, maybe a symbol of shrewd leadership in a world designed to keep her out. Absolutely. The reason she continues to captivate isn't because she fit neatly into the role of ancient queens, but because she shattered that role completely. In military circles, naval historians still bring up her name, often pointing to her as a unique example of a woman commanding warships so long ago. In literary and political discussions, she's seen as a symbol of reason in a time of arrogance. And in popular culture, she pops up now and then, sometimes distorted, sometimes idealized, but always recognizable. But here's the thing. Artemisia wasn't concerned with her legacy in the way we think about it today. She wasn't trying to build a personal brand or write her memoirs. She was focused on survival, on maintaining her rule, and on achieving victory. That's why her story still resonates so strongly. It wasn't created out of ego or elaborate stories. It was shaped by the decisions she made, difficult, controversial decisions, and, more often than not, the right ones. She wasn't loyal to Persia, nor was she loyal to Greece. She was loyal only to herself. As the centuries rolled on, Artemisia's story changed, as all great stories eventually do. She stopped being just a historical figure. She became a myth, a metaphor, and sometimes even a monster. Writers and playwrights reimagined her to suit their own purposes. In some stories, she was a cruel seductress. In others, a bloodthirsty warrior queen. The real Artemisia, the strategist, the realist, the survivor, was buried under layers of fantasy and fear. Part of the reason for this distortion is simple. Men didn't know what to make of her. A woman who gave orders, who didn't fall apart in the face of war, who told kings they were wrong and then proved it. One of their key contributions was the meticulous recording of eclipses. They not only predicted solar and lunar eclipses, but sometimes tied them to dynastic omens. If an eclipse occurred and the emperor hadn't been forewarned, it was considered a failure of the astronomers and sometimes a sign that the emperor had lost the mandate of heaven. In short, astronomy in China wasn't tucked away in a scholar's study. It stood at the very core of governance, divinity, and national survival. The stars didn't just tell time. They told the truth, and the empire listened. In ancient India, astronomy was never a separate discipline. It was interwoven with philosophy, ritual, mathematics, and metaphysics. Known as Jyotisha, the science of light, Indian astronomy began as a tool for determining auspicious timings for rituals, but evolved into one of the most mathematically advanced systems of celestial observation in the ancient world. The earliest references to celestial events appear in the Vedas, composed around 1500 BCE. These sacred texts mention the sun, moon, and planetary cycles, as well as the division of the sky into 27 nakshatras, lunar mansions, that formed the core of early Indian sky mapping. These nakshatras were tied to both mythology and calculation, forming the basis of astrological charts and calendars still used in India today. But Indian astronomy wasn't just poetic. It was shockingly precise. Ancient scholars developed models for the solar year that were more accurate than the Julian calendar introduced much later by the Romans. The Surya Siddhanta, a foundational astronomical text compiled around 500 CE, based on earlier knowledge, describes the Earth's axial tilt, the elliptical orbits of planets, and even the concept of gravity centuries before Newton. Perhaps the most revolutionary figure in Indian astronomy was Aryabhata, who, in 499 CE, the Native American nations who resided there were not consulted in the deal. They weren't even notified. They received no compensation. One day they were sovereign peoples. The next they were declared subjects of the expanding American Republic. Jefferson believed that Native American people could either assimilate into American society or relocate peacefully, if possible, but forcibly if necessary. In private letters, he wrote that as settlers moved west, indigenous people would have to move westward as well or perish. It wasn't yet called removal, but the idea was already taking shape. This pressure intensified after the Lewis and Clark expedition returned with news of abundant land and natural wealth. The federal government began negotiating treaties, many of them deceptive or coercive, to claim land and push tribes further west. In some cases, military force backed these efforts. In others, disease and displacement accomplished the same goal. The Louisiana Purchase marked the start of a new phase in U.S. expansion. Manifest destiny before it had a name. The belief that the United States was destined to control the continent had its legal foundation in this sale and its moral cost in the lives and lands of Native American nations. For indigenous peoples, the Louisiana Purchase was not a transaction. It was a trespass. It redrew maps that had never been theirs, erased boundaries that had never been acknowledged, and unleashed a wave of settlers who came not to trade, but to take. And that wave was only just beginning. The Louisiana Purchase was celebrated as a triumph, a peaceful acquisition of territory that nearly doubled the size of the United States. But while the land deal was clean on paper, the reality on the ground was anything but. Expansion came at a price, paid not in gold, but in conflict, displacement, and cultural destruction. You plant, you weed, you hope a bandit raid doesn't happen today, and when the sun finally goes down, you limp home, only to discover that one of your oxen is missing and the village headman would very much like to speak with you about your grain shortfall. Taxes are relentless. You don't get paid in coins. You actually pay them with rice. Your family eats whatever's left, which isn't much, especially if the harvest was bad, or if your lord's nephew accidentally rode a horse right through your plot during a military drill. Want to complain about any of this? Well, that's just adorable. You can't. Talking back will get you whipped, exiled, or just simply promoted to corpse. If you're really, really lucky, you might actually become a village elder, which means people still won't actually listen to you, but now they'll ask for your advice right before ignoring it. And remember, you're legally not even allowed to leave your village without permission. You are, in effect, a rice-based prisoner with seasonal ankle rot. Festivals? There are some. You get drunk on weak sake, dance in a circle, and try your absolute best not to think about how planting season starts all over again in about 4 days. So yes, you are the very foundation of the entire economy, the reason the samurai get to eat, and also the person that everyone conveniently forgets even exists. And no, you absolutely do not get a day off because feudal Japan believes in hard work, generational suffering, and keeping expectations extremely, extremely low. You're hungry. Of course you are. You've been tilling, planting, sweating, and politely not dying since sunrise. Time to eat. But in feudal Japan, meals aren't exactly about indulgence. They're about survival, simplicity, and definitely not choking on a fishbone right in front of your in-laws. If you're a peasant, your diet is pretty much just rice. Rice for breakfast, rice for lunch, and rice for dinner. If you're lucky, it's actually rice. The way you arrange flowers, pour tea, or fold a kimono isn't left up to chance. It follows strict rules that have been around for longer than your entire family history. One misplaced flower, and suddenly you're the talk of the village, and not in a good way. Take the tea ceremony, for example. It looks like a quiet, peaceful ritual, but in reality, it's a social minefield. Everything is timed perfectly, and every movement is choreographed. The guest must sit just right, turn the cup twice, express humble gratitude, and drink in silence, all while mentally calculating whether they've bowed too early, too late, or too enthusiastically. If you make a mistake, at best, it's awkward. At worst, it's seen as a character flaw or a moral failing passed down from your disgraceful great-granduncle. Then, there's calligraphy, a beautiful form of expression, right? Wrong. It's a test of discipline, personality, and the alignment of your inner spirit. That brush stroke isn't just ink. It's a reflection of your soul's posture. If you have messy handwriting, you might as well wear a sign that says, emotionally unstable and bad at bowing. Even poetry is dangerous. You don't just write a haiku. You write it in the proper season, on the correct type of paper, using metaphors that reference both nature and your emotional state, without getting too personal or too passionate. If you lack refinement, you're too dry. If you're too clever, you're spiritually cold. If you're showing off, nobody will invite you to the moon viewing party. Culture here is a delicate game. You participate not to relax, but to prove that you're composed, refined, and terrified of appearing uncultured. Beauty in feudal Japan isn't effortless. It's a battlefield in silk robes. And if your flower arrangement doesn't follow the rules, may the gods have mercy on your bonsai tree. That didn't sit well with the ancient world. So, storytellers did what they often do when faced with a woman they can't control. They rewrote her story. One strange legend claimed that she fell madly in love with a man who didn't love her back, and in a fit of despair, she threw herself off a cliff. Not exactly the kind of thing you'd expect from a steely naval commander, but it served the purpose of turning a story of strength into a story of tragedy. Another version portrayed her as a poisonous schemer, more of a witch than a queen. It's a pattern that repeats itself throughout history. When a woman gains power through her intelligence or daring, later generations either soften her into a damsel in distress or turn her into a villain. Artemisia got both treatments, and neither one of them reflected the truth. The real Artemisia didn't rule through seduction or magic. She ruled with vision, reason, and a cold, strategic brilliance. She played a man's game by her own rules, and she won. That, more than anything, terrified those who came after her. Because if one woman could do it, what would stop others from following in her footsteps? Even today, adaptations continue to misrepresent her. Hollywood, for example, turned her into a vengeful femme fatale in 300, Rise of an Empire. Entertaining? Sure. Accurate? Absolutely not. But the fact that she still attracts attention, still inspires reimagining, proves one thing: her legacy has staying power. The woman they feared never really died. She evolved into a myth, into a memory, and into the uncomfortable question that history keeps asking. What if more women had been like Artemisia? When Artemisia of Curia disappeared from the historical records, she didn't disappear from history. She simply changed form. Like the wake behind a warship, her legacy continued to spread long after her final voyage. No elaborate tomb marks her final resting place. No statues of her exist. Proposed that the Earth rotates on its axis daily, a theory rarely entertained in other parts of the world at that time. He also calculated the length of the solar year at 365, 258 days, just a tiny fraction off from modern values, and developed advanced trigonometric functions to assist in astronomical calculations. Indian astronomers also created sophisticated sundials, worked with decimal notation, and used shadow instruments and spheres to measure angles and altitudes. Observatories were often aligned with solstices, equinoxes, and planetary conjunctions. But beyond technical achievements, Indian astronomy carried a cosmic elegance. The universe wasn't just a machine. It was a cycle, a dance of time and space unfolding endlessly. Astronomy wasn't about domination over nature. It was about harmony with it. In the Indian worldview, understanding the heavens was a way of understanding the self, a geometry of the spirit where planets moved not just across the sky, but through the soul. If other civilizations looked to the sky for guidance, ritual, or survival, the ancient Greeks looked up and asked why. Why do the stars move? Why do planets wander? And, most importantly, can the cosmos be explained by reason? Greek astronomy marked a turning point in humanity's relationship with the heavens. Where others saw patterns and portents, the Greeks sought laws. They weren't just observers. They were theorists trying to decode the sky using mathematics, geometry, and philosophy. It began with Thales of Miletus, one of the first to suggest that celestial phenomena had natural causes. Then came Anaximander, who imagined the Earth floating in space unsupported and suggested that the heavens formed a sphere. These ideas may sound crude today, but for their time they were revolutionary. The true leap came with Pythagoras, who viewed the cosmos as a system of perfect harmony, a music of the spheres governed by mathematical ratios. With the new territory secured, American settlers began flooding westward, driven by dreams of fertile farmland, personal freedom, and economic opportunity. They pushed into lands still inhabited by indigenous nations. The federal government followed, establishing forts, roads, and administrative posts to manage and enforce its new authority. This set the stage for a slow-burning collision between two fundamentally different visions of the land. One that saw it as property to be claimed and improved, and another that saw it as a living entity to be shared and respected. Unsurprisingly, conflict erupted. Skirmishes escalated into wars. Treaties were signed, then broken, and slowly, the frontier line moved further west, propelled by the force of rifles, railroads, and relentless ambition. But it wasn't just indigenous nations who paid a price. The Louisiana Territory also intensified a moral crisis that would eventually tear the nation apart. Slavery. Southern leaders immediately recognized the vast new lands as an opportunity to expand plantation agriculture. Cotton and sugar thrived in the southern portions of the territory, and enslaved labor was seen as essential to making it profitable. This raised a highly volatile question. Would slavery be permitted in the new territories? The answer would haunt Congress for decades, leading to the Missouri Compromise, heightened sectional tensions, and, ultimately, the Civil War. The Louisiana Purchase didn't just stretch America's borders. It stretched its political fabric to the breaking point. And there were significant environmental consequences as well. The rivers were dammed, the plains plowed, and the buffalo nearly wiped out. The transformation was rapid and irreversible. What had once been a landscape shaped by fire, herds, and indigenous stewardship became a patchwork of farms, fences, and industrial extraction. If you're not so lucky, it's barley pretending to be rice. You might get a turnip or two. Some pickled radish if the gods happen to be in a particularly good mood. Meat, that's for the daimyo, or for that one chicken that looked at you funny and mysteriously disappeared. Fish, sometimes, but it's dried, salted, and sharp enough to actually file your teeth. Soup, usually just miso, if you can actually call hot salt water with like 2 floating leaves soup. It's flavorful, yes, in the same way that seawater is hydrating. Now, if you're a samurai, you do actually get better food, but you also eat last after your lord, his guests, and anyone else he feels like impressing. That means cold rice, cold soup, and the eternal joy of watching other people eat while pretending that you're deeply honored to wait. Also, everything is seasonal. Not because it's trendy, but because there's no refrigeration, no global supply chain, and if you don't harvest it yourself, it probably doesn't even exist. So, when it's winter, that's just nature's way of subtly suggesting fasting. And heaven forbid you get food poisoning. Medical care is, well, optimistic. The local remedy is pretty much just lie down and think about your ancestors. You'll either get better or become one of them. Food theft is actually a serious crime. Steal a bowl of rice and you're not just getting a slap on the wrist. You're getting a very public demonstration of why we don't ever touch the daimyo's daikin. Tea? Surround, but not in the way that you're probably imagining. The tea ceremony is a complex performance that's more about posture, etiquette, and existential humility than actually quenching your thirst. So yes, meals are sacred, quiet, and respectful, but mostly they're bland, small, and contain at least one crunchy mystery item. And no, you can't complain. Not unless you want your next meal served right through your nose. Okay, so you've just finished your modest bowl of crunchy, maybe fish soup. After everything we've seen, the hierarchy, the hygiene, the honor, the endless rice, let's be honest, you wouldn't last a day in feudal Japan. Not because you're weak or soft, but because this wasn't a society designed for survival. It was designed for submission, precision, and quiet, relentless obedience. Every moment was a test of your posture, your loyalty, and whether or not you bowed at precisely the correct depth while reciting a seasonal greeting in the right emotional tone. If you failed, there were consequences. Public shame at best, ritual suicide at worst. There were no days off and no opportunities to just be yourself. You were born into a role, given a script, and expected to perform it with deadly elegance for the rest of your life. Deviating from that script wasn't seen as brave. It was seen as dangerous. The individual didn't matter. The clan did. The lord did. The land did. If you were a samurai, you carried the weight of centuries of honor and the very real threat of having to write poetry before slicing open your own abdomen. If you were a peasant, you worked the land from dawn until your spine became a question mark, hoping that the weather didn't betray you, or your lord didn't. If you were a woman, your life was a carefully managed exercise in grace, silence, and sacrifice. And if you were anyone else, well, the system was designed to make sure you stayed exactly where you were. Feudal Japan was beautiful, yes, breathtakingly so. The architecture, the rituals, the poetry, the art, all meticulously curated. But that beauty had sharp edges. It required discipline so tight it could break bones, and it demanded respect so absolute it swallowed individuality whole. So, no, you wouldn't last. You'd speak out of turn, laugh too loudly, or accidentally step over a threshold with your left foot instead of your right. You'd forget to bow, you'd ask a question, you'd want to change something, and that alone would mark you as a threat to the order. And yet, her presence remains, etched into the stones of Halicarnassus, whispered in the pages of ancient texts, and debated by historians trying to figure out how she accomplished the impossible. Because Artemisia's life was, in fact, impossible. She ruled when women weren't supposed to rule, fought in wars where women weren't supposed to fight, and gave advice when women weren't supposed to speak. And yet somehow she was heard. She wasn't just tolerated. She was respected. That might be her greatest accomplishment. Not just surviving as a woman in power in the ancient world, but earning the kind of reluctant admiration that made even her enemies stop and take notice. Centuries later, her name remains a paradox, both celebrated and obscured. She's not as well known as Cleopatra or Joan of Arc, but maybe that's appropriate. Artemisia wasn't chasing fame. She was focused on results. She wasn't associated with mythical beauty or tragic romance. She was a leader, a realist, a strategist. Her story played out not in poetry, but in the quiet of war rooms, in the confined spaces of a ship, and in the unwavering gaze of a king who chose to listen. Today, her story invites us to look at her again, not just as a woman in a man's world, but as a reminder that courage doesn't always wear a crown or carry a sword. Sometimes it sits on the edge of power, says the unpopular thing, and sails straight into chaos. Artemisia didn't need to be rescued. She didn't need to be rewritten. What she needed, and what she still deserves, is to be remembered as she was: sharp, dangerous, and brilliant. In an empire built by men, she charted her own course across treacherous seas, against societal norms, and through the fog of war. And as long as ships sail and history remembers those who dared to speak when silence was the safer option, Artemisia of Caria will never truly be forgotten. His followers believed the universe could be understood through numbers, laying the foundation for theoretical astronomy. But it was Aristarchus of Samos who came closest to modern truth. In the 3rd century B.C.E., he proposed a heliocentric model with the sun, not the earth, at the center of the universe. His ideas were ignored for nearly 2,000 years, but they planted a seed that would later bloom with Copernicus. Then came Hipparchus, the father of observational astronomy. He created the first star catalog, divided stars by brightness, discovered the precession of the equinoxes, and developed trigonometric tools to calculate celestial positions. His accuracy was astonishing, especially without telescopes. And finally, there was Claudius Ptolemy, whose Almagest became the authoritative astronomical text for over a millennium. He synthesized Greek, Babylonian, and Egyptian knowledge into a geocentric model that explained planetary motion using epicycles and deference, a complex yet elegant system that worked until it didn't. While some Greek ideas were wrong, their commitment to rational explanation and systematic modeling changed the game. They taught the world that the stars weren't random. They were governed by patterns that the human mind could understand. With the Greeks, astronomy became more than observation. It became an argument between earth and sky, between logic and myth, and between what we see and what we know. By the time the telescope was invented in the early 17th century, humanity had already spent thousands of years watching the skies with nothing but eyes, shadows, and stone. And yet, what those ancient civilizations achieved is nothing short of astonishing. They mapped stars, tracked planets, predicted eclipses, and built monuments aligned with solstices and equinoxes, all without lenses, satellites, or electricity. What makes their accomplishments even more extraordinary is that they did it independently. In seizing the land, the United States also inherited the burden of its actions, a legacy that still resonates in debates over land rights, tribal sovereignty, and reparations. The land may have been purchased, but the true cost continues to be paid. Once the ink had dried on the Louisiana Purchase, a new question arose. How exactly do you govern a territory so vast that it defied imagination? The land encompassed what would become all or part of 15 modern U.S. states, from Louisiana to Montana and from the Dakotas to Colorado. But in 1803, it was an undefined wilderness, full of potential but lacking roads, towns, and clearly defined claims. The first step was surveying, mapping out borders, rivers, mountains, and eventually property lines. Expeditions like those led by Lewis and Clark, Zebulon Pike, and others laid the essential groundwork. Cartographers, land speculators, and military engineers followed, drawing maps that would gradually evolve into county lines, reservations, and state borders. What had been an open and interconnected indigenous world was now being divided into rigid rectangles. Congress passed laws to organize the territory, initially as military districts, then as organized territories, each with governors appointed by the federal government. These new administrative units adhered to the pattern established by the Northwest Ordinance. Once a territory had a sufficient number of settlers, it could apply for statehood. However, not all borders were drawn with logic or fairness. Consider the creation of Missouri in 1821, the first state carved from the Louisiana Purchase. Its admission triggered national outrage because Missouri sought to allow slavery. The resulting Missouri Compromise drew an arbitrary line across the Purchase, allowing slavery south of it and prohibiting it to the north. Someone says something completely absurd. Maybe your lord mumbles a bad haiku. Maybe your village elder misquotes Confucius. Maybe your neighbor insists that his cow can actually predict the weather. And for one reckless, foolish moment, you think about correcting them. Don't. In feudal Japan, your opinion is basically a liability. Free speech isn't a concept. It's a fast track to disgrace, exile, or sudden, career-ending decapitation. The social hierarchy is rigid, and every single word has a weight. Speak above your class, you're being impudent. Criticize someone above you, you're insolent. Make a joke that doesn't land, that's treason adjacent. Even within families, you have to tread incredibly carefully. A son doesn't interrupt his father. A wife doesn't correct her husband. And no one, absolutely no one, questions the daimyo, unless they've always really wanted to explore the afterlife via sword tip. Samurai are trained to speak with measured calm, even when they're absolutely furious. A sharp tongue is actually worse than a dull blade. It's unbecoming, it's dangerous, and it might even force someone into the awkward position of having to kill you just to restore their honor. Which brings us to apologies. In feudal Japan, apologies are a genuine art form. You don't just say sorry, you bow. You grovel. You possibly write a poem about your deep shame. You might even send a gift, like a live bird or a decorative comb, all while sincerely hoping that the person receiving it doesn't decide to just duel you anyway. And God's help you if your tone is even slightly too casual. A misplaced word can easily be interpreted as sarcasm, defiance, or just general spiritual rot. Silence is almost always safer. Even humor is a tightrope walk. Laughing at the wrong thing could easily be seen as disrespect. Laughing with someone important might just imply that you think you're actually on their level. And that's how people end up mysteriously reassigned to the far north. But that's the brilliance and the tragedy of feudal Japan. It wasn't made to be easy. It was made to endure. In an age where women were barely allowed to speak in public, let alone command an army, Artemisia of Curia existed as a historical anomaly. Someone who, by all the rules of ancient society, shouldn't have been possible. And yet, there she was, seated on a throne, carrying the double burden of queen and naval commander, plotting war alongside some of the most powerful men in the ancient world. Artemisia ruled Halicarnassus, a city located along the southwestern coast of Asia Minor, in modern-day Turkey. Technically a vassal under the vast Persian Empire, Halicarnassus was part of a collection of territories often caught between the major regional powers. But Artemisia didn't just inherit a political position. She made it a force to be reckoned with. She was Greek by blood, Persian by loyalty, and a woman by birth, each identity carrying immense weight in an era dominated by iron and testosterone. Her father was likely of Carian descent, while her mother came from the island of Crete. Upon her husband's death, instead of stepping aside for a male successor, Artemisia claimed the throne for herself. That was already an act of quiet defiance, but she didn't stop at just ruling. She wanted to conquer. When Xerxes the Great launched his legendary invasion of Greece around 480 BCE, Artemisia did something that no other woman of her time dared to do. She volunteered for war, not to stitch bandages or offer prayers from a safe distance, but to command ships and risk death. She supplied 5 of her own vessels, sleek, fast, and deadly, and led them personally into the thick of battle. And Xerxes, ruler of an empire that stretched from India to Egypt, didn't just tolerate her presence. He listened to her and valued her opinions. It was a bold move, some might even call it foolish. A Greek fighting for Persia, treasonous. A woman on a warship, unthinkable. Before telescopes and satellites, before Copernicus dared to rearrange the cosmos, humans had only 2 tools for unraveling the secrets of the sky: the naked eye and stone. And somehow that was enough. Across the ancient world, civilizations looked up, not just in awe, but with a purpose. The stars weren't just decorations. They were calendars, compasses, gods, and prophecies. And so began astronomy, the oldest science of them all. Long before it had a name, it was a necessity. Farmers needed to know when to plant their crops. Sailors needed to know how to navigate. Priests needed to know when to perform the correct ritual at the precise celestial moment. And astronomers, who were often also priests, kings, or mathematicians, were the ones everyone relied on. But without telescopes, how did they do it? They built temples not just for worship, but for observation. Massive structures like Stonehenge in England, Nabta Playa in Egypt, and the Great Pyramids of Mesoamerica weren't just tombs or altars. They were observatories, carefully aligned with the movements of the sun, moon, and stars. Many were designed to capture specific light patterns during solstices and equinoxes, sacred architecture with an astronomical purpose. The great temple of Ammonius-Ra at Karnak in Egypt, for example, was oriented so that the sun would rise precisely between its pylons on the summer solstice. The Maya at Chichen Itza built El Castillo, a pyramid that casts a shadow of a serpent slithering down its staircase on the spring and autumn equinoxes. In India, vast stone instruments like the Jantar Mantar allowed astronomers to track the declination of celestial bodies with remarkable precision. These weren't accidents. These weren't crude guesses. These were deliberate, data-driven feats of cosmic engineering. And they weren't isolated. From the Andes to the Nile, from Babylon to Beijing, humans were building with the stars in mind, setting stones in alignment with starlight. The Sumerians in Mesopotamia, the Maya in Mesoamerica, the Chinese and Indians in Asia, the Greeks and Egyptians around the Mediterranean. They all developed astronomical systems rooted in their own worldviews. Yet, despite being oceans apart, they arrived at similar conclusions. The heavens move with order, and that order matters. Ancient astronomy wasn't confined to ivory towers. It shaped agriculture, religion, architecture, politics, and philosophy. It dictated when to plant, when to pray, when to build, and when to rule. In every culture, understanding the sky was seen as a way of understanding the divine, or at the very least, one's place in the vast machinery of existence. And while their models varied, some geocentric, some mythological, some cyclical, they all shared one trait: a deep, unwavering respect for the heavens. For many ancient peoples, the cosmos was more than just a background. It was a living, breathing entity, intentional in its actions and deeply sacred. While the invention of the telescope would ultimately revolutionize our understanding, revealing moons orbiting Jupiter, the phases of Venus, sunspots, and galaxies stretching far beyond our own, it was the groundwork laid by the ancients that paved the way. Their patient mapping, systematic record-keeping, and sheer curiosity are a legacy we carry with us today. Every time we check a calendar, use a phone app to map the stars, or celebrate a solstice, we are building upon their foundations. Every GPS, satellite, and space mission owes its existence to the knowledge they painstakingly recorded on clay, stone, and papyrus. They may not have known about black holes or the cosmic microwave background, but they asked the fundamental questions. They looked up at the night sky and took notice of what they saw, even without fully understanding it. In doing so, they became the world's first scientists, quietly and faithfully writing their questions in the sky. This single line would haunt American politics for decades, as each new state's status threatened to disrupt the delicate balance between the North and the South. Meanwhile, white settlers poured into the new territories, often ahead of the law. They claimed land through preemption, squatting, and increasingly through federally sponsored land grants. Native peoples, even those with existing treaties, found their land suddenly reclassified, first as territory, then as open land, and finally as someone else's farm. And while maps were being filled in, they were also erasing native trails, erasing seasonal migrations, erasing indigenous names, and replacing them with names like Jefferson City, Baton Rouge, and Fort Pierre. Borders in this new vision of America weren't just lines on a map. They were instruments of control, ways to claim, divide, sell, and govern land that just a few years earlier had belonged to no president, no state, and certainly no empire. The Louisiana Purchase didn't just reshape America's borders. It redefined its identity. With a single diplomatic stroke, the United States transformed from a coastal republic clinging to the Atlantic into a continental power stretching toward the unknown. It was the first significant leap toward manifest destiny, even before the term existed, and it set the stage for the next century of expansion, conquest, and reinvention. Politically, the purchase established the precedent that the federal government could acquire new land through treaties, even without explicit constitutional guidance. That precedent would be used again with Florida, Texas, Oregon, Alaska, and Hawaii. The U.S. became not just a country but a collector of territory, a nation constantly looking westward. Culturally, it fostered a new kind of American myth, that of the frontier. The Louisiana Territory became the setting for stories of rugged settlers, daring explorers, and boundless opportunity. So yes, you're technically free to speak, but in practice you nod, you smile, and you pray that your opinion never even tries to escape your mouth. Because in feudal Japan, loose lips don't just sink ships. They sink social standing, reputations, and sometimes your entire bloodline. In feudal Japan, fashion isn't about self-expression. It's about making absolutely sure that everyone knows exactly how far below them you are just by looking at your sleeves. Your clothing doesn't reflect your personality. It reflects your position, your purpose, and whether or not you're even legally allowed to carry a sword without getting tackled by a samurai. Let's start right at the top. Samurai wear layers of silk robes, sometimes armored, always dignified. Their outfits are carefully arranged to signal their status and their readiness. The colors, the deep blues, the earthy browns, and the occasional blood-red flourish, elegant, ominous, and almost always implying, I have absolutely killed a man for less than a fashion faux pas. And of course, there are the swords. A samurai's daisho, the paired long and short swords, is actually more than just a weapon set. It's a walking badge of authority. Drawing one in public is an absolute last resort. Wearing them improperly is pretty much the first step toward being publicly corrected with extreme sharpness. Peasants, on the other hand, wear cotton and humility. Brown, gray, and beige pretty much dominate your entire wardrobe. It's not because they're minimalists. It's because dyed fabric actually costs money, and you're far too busy trying to survive to even worry about coordinating hues. Your outfit basically says, yes, I work in mud. No, I definitely didn't choose this lifestyle. Yes, these are my only sandals. Merchants wear finer materials. They have money, after all, but they're still socially ranked below both samurai and peasants, so they tend to keep it muted. Rich, but not too rich. Silk, definitely, but subdued. But Artemisia knew exactly what she was doing. She wasn't motivated by loyalty to bloodlines or empires. She was playing the game of survival and power, and she played it better than most of the men around her. In a world carved up by men with swords, Artemisia didn't ask for permission. She built her fleet, sailed into history, and dared anyone to try and stop her. By siding with Xerxes, Artemisia essentially declared war on her own people, the Greeks. It was a decision that raised eyebrows even before a single or hit the water, and it wasn't just the usual whispers of treachery. This was personal. To the Greeks, she was a traitor in fancy clothes, a queen turned mercenary, a woman who had traded her heritage for favor at a foreign king's table. But Artemisia didn't seem the least bit bothered. In fact, she doubled down, sailing into the campaign as if she belonged at the high table of Persian power, and in many ways she did. Xerxes, known for surrounding himself with brutal warriors and sycophants, found something rare in Artemisia: Honesty, blunt, piercing honesty. She told him not what he wanted to hear, but what he needed to know. In council meetings, surrounded by decorated generals and satraps with bloodied boots, Artemisia spoke with clarity and strategy, and she was rarely wrong. Her advice was sharp, tactical, and often laced with warnings that others were too proud to voice. Before the infamous Battle of Salamis, she urged Xerxes to avoid a direct naval confrontation with the Greeks, warning him that the cramped straits would eliminate Persia's numerical advantage. But Xerxes, swayed by overconfidence and flattery, ignored her, a decision that would come back to haunt him. Even among her Persian allies, Artemisia's presence was complicated. Many commanders resented her authority. After all, she wasn't just a woman. She was a Greek woman, one who told truth to power and led her own ships with unnerving precision. They charted planetary motions, eclipses, and even retrograde movement using nothing but patience, observation, and a profound sense of cosmic order. The sky wasn't just watched. It was measured, mapped, and built into the very foundations of their cities. Long before glass could magnify the heavens, civilizations were already recording their rhythm in stone, in silence, and with astonishing accuracy. In the sun-baked floodplains of ancient Mesopotamia, the Sumerians looked up and saw not just stars, but structure. Around 3000 B.C.E., they weren't simply telling stories about the heavens. They were organizing life around them. For the Sumerians, the sky wasn't random. It was a cosmic schedule, and their job was to interpret it correctly. These early astronomers laid the foundation for what we now call celestial mechanics. They observed the regular motions of the sun, moon, and planets, and realized that these movements weren't chaotic. They were clocks. That's how they developed one of the earliest known calendars, dividing the year based on the lunar cycle. It wasn't perfect, but it was remarkably effective for tracking agricultural and ritual events. And speaking of time, the Sumerians gave us the sexagesimal system, the base 60 counting method that's still baked into how we measure minutes, seconds, and degrees. When you glance at a clock showing 60 minutes in an hour or 360 degrees in a circle, you're echoing a 5,000-year-old way of thinking. They didn't have telescopes, but they had ziggurats, step towers rising toward the heavens. From these platforms, priest astronomers kept careful records on clay tablets, noting when Venus appeared on the horizon, when the moon turned red during an eclipse, or when a star cluster returned after months below the horizon. Their word for these watchers, Umanu, meant learned ones, encompassing both scientists and spiritual guides. Over time, Sumerian stargazing would evolve into something more systematic. And thanks to their dedication, we now possess the tools to delve deeper, not only into the vastness of space but also into our own origins. In 1803, an event of unprecedented magnitude occurred. A young republic, barely 3 decades old, purchased a landmass so expansive that it doubled its territory overnight. The Louisiana Purchase was far more than a simple real estate transaction. It was a geopolitical earthquake. With the mere stroke of a pen, the United States acquired over 828,000 square miles of land from France, stretching from the Mississippi River to the majestic Rocky Mountains. This vast and fertile terrain would eventually give rise to 13 future states, all for the remarkably low price of $15 million, approximately 4 cents per acre. What makes this event even more extraordinary is that no one, including the Americans themselves, anticipated it. At the time, President Thomas Jefferson had a singular objective: to secure access to the Mississippi River and the strategically vital port city of New Orleans. The young nation relied heavily on river trade, with farmers in the Ohio Valley needing a way to transport their goods south. Whoever controlled New Orleans held the key to economic survival. Jefferson authorized diplomats to offer France up to $10 million for New Orleans and some surrounding lands. Nothing more. However, when those diplomats arrived, they were met with a stunning counteroffer. The French were willing to sell not just New Orleans, but the entire Louisiana territory. Why? France, under the rule of Napoleon Bonaparte, was undergoing a shift in its priorities. Napoleon had envisioned a grand North American empire, but the Haitian Revolution had shattered French ambitions in the Caribbean. Disease, rebellion, and escalating tensions with Britain made holding on to Louisiana more of a burden than an asset. Napoleon needed funds for his wars, not for swamps and prairies. But for every pioneer's dream, there was a Native American nightmare. A memory of land lost, treaties broken, and people forced into exile. Economically, the impact was staggering. The Mississippi River became the lifeblood of American commerce. Cities like St. Louis, New Orleans, and Kansas City evolved into vital trade hubs. Fertile plains were transformed into farmland, and the discovery of gold, silver, and other natural resources would turn portions of the purchase into engines of industrial growth. However, the deeper legacy is one of contradiction. The purchase represented American ideals of opportunity, growth, and independence, yet it also embodied America's deepest failures: dispossession, slavery, and imperial ambition. It's a story of triumph etched onto land taken from others, often violently. Today, the boundaries of the Louisiana Purchase define states that millions call home. Highways crisscross where buffalo once roamed. Fields of wheat now grow where sacred grounds once stood. And yet, beneath the soil and asphalt, the memory of that purchase still lingers, not just as a transaction, but as a turning point. The United States was forever changed by it, as was the world. But the question remains, was the cost purely monetary, or was it, as many would later argue, measured in lives, cultures, and landscapes that could never be bought back? In the end, the Louisiana Purchase was more than a land deal. It was a defining moment, a shift in American identity from a fragile republic clinging to the eastern seaboard to an empire in the making, boldly stretching into the interior. The ink dried in Paris, but the consequences echoed across prairies, rivers, and generations. For the United States, it signified possibility. It ignited a new national confidence, a belief that expansion was not only desirable but inevitable. That belief would solidify into policy, becoming manifest destiny, and would eventually drive the U.S. to the Pacific Ocean and beyond. Wealthy merchant families are actually experts at looking just respectable enough to not get noticed by a bored samurai on patrol. Artisans and craftsmen dress neatly, but modestly. Their clothing is durable, practical, and most importantly, unobtrusive. Drawing any attention to yourself is pretty much considered a personality defect. And then there are women who have to strike a delicate balance between grace, obedience, and wearing about 12 layers of folded symbolism. Hairstyles are carefully coded. Kimono patterns are seasonal. And if you accidentally wear a color that's meant for a different festival, congratulations. You've just dishonored your entire household and possibly started a neighborhood whisper war. In short, what you wear isn't just about clothing. It's about rank, ritual, and surviving daily judgment from both heaven and your mother-in-law. So, you're imagining moonlit walks beneath the cherry blossoms, whispered poetry under paper lanterns, perhaps even a dramatic kiss between a samurai and a forbidden princess. Yeah, no. In feudal Japan, love is pretty much just a side quest, and not one that you're actually likely to complete. Marriage isn't about feelings. It's about alliances, status, rice taxes, and definitely not embarrassing your ancestors. If you're a peasant, your marriage is arranged by your parents and maybe the village elder. Romantic compatibility just isn't discussed. Sturdy legs and healthy teeth are generally considered far more important. If you're from a samurai family, the stakes are even higher. Marriages are essentially tools of politics. Your partner is chosen to solidify a clan alliance, secure land, or pay off a grudge with a nice kimono. The goal isn't happiness. It's stability. Ideally, one that doesn't collapse during harvest season. Love letters? Maybe, but only if they're written in perfect calligraphy using the appropriate seasonal metaphors and passed along discreetly by a maid who definitely knows way too much. She wasn't there as a figurehead or a symbolic mascot. She was there to win, and that unsettled more than a few mustachioed warlords who had spent their entire lives in the business of conquest. Meanwhile, back in Greece, her name spread like a stain. Herodotus himself, from Halicarnassus, seemed both fascinated and baffled by her. He documented her with a mix of awe and suspicion usually reserved for mythical creatures. To some, she was Medusa in a breastplate. To others, a misunderstood genius with the audacity to think like a man, and better than most of them. Artemisia was many things. A loyalist, a strategist, a traitor, a visionary. But above all, she was a political animal who understood one hard truth. In war, identity bends, and only power remains. If there was ever a moment that tested Artemisia's brilliance and boldness, it was the Battle of Salamis. This wasn't just any battle. It was the naval showdown of the Greco-Persian Wars. The Persian fleet, massive and overconfident, faced off against a much smaller but strategically positioned Greek navy in the narrow straits near Athens. It was here that Xerxes' campaign would falter, and it was here that Artemisia would make one of the most shocking tactical moves of her career. Let's rewind a bit. Artemisia had warned Xerxes against engaging the Greeks in these narrow waters. She correctly argued that their superior maneuverability and familiarity with the terrain would negate the Persian size advantage, but Xerxes, drunk on numbers and pride, dismissed her warning. He wanted a spectacular victory. What he got instead was humiliation. As the battle raged, chaos engulfed the Persian lines. Ships collided, formations broke apart, and Greek triremes darted like sharks between the lumbering vessels. It was a slaughter, and in the middle of it all was Artemisia, commanding her flagship, surrounded by both allies and enemies, trying to survive a battle that was quickly falling apart. Their descendants, the Babylonians, built vast star catalogs, predicted eclipses with eerie accuracy, and gave names to constellations that are still in use today. But it all began with the Sumerians, scribbling celestial movements in cuneiform and laying down the earliest astronomical records we've ever found. Perhaps most impressive is how this early science blended seamlessly with mythology. To them, the sky was divine yet predictable. The gods moved in patterns, and if you understood those patterns, you could align your crops, your rituals, and your destiny. The Sumerians didn't just look up in awe. They looked up and began to measure. And in doing so, they started humanity's long relationship with the stars. If the Sumerians lit the first fire of astronomy, the Babylonians poured oil on it and turned it into an inferno of precision. By the time their empire flourished around 1800 B.C.E., Babylonian astronomers weren't just watching the skies. They were predicting them. Eclipses, planetary conjunctions, retrograde motion, all charted, logged, and projected with stunning regularity. They weren't guessing. They were calculating. The Babylonians took the Sumerians' observational legacy and supercharged it with math. They recorded the positions of stars, planets, and the moon on clay tablets known today as the Enuma Anu Enlil and the Mul Apin, some of the oldest known astronomical texts in existence. Faced with this unexpected opportunity, the American negotiators wasted no time in accepting, even before obtaining full approval from Jefferson. After all, this wasn't just a port. It was the Mississippi River, the Great Plains, access to the Rocky Mountains, and future control over the very heart of the continent. What Jefferson received was not merely land, but destiny itself. A blank canvas for westward expansion, national growth, and, inevitably, conflict. But amidst the celebrations in the newspapers, one crucial truth was overlooked. This land was far from empty. It was already home to dozens of Native American nations, each with its own distinct history, alliances, and claims. And so, a deal made in Paris would not only reshape maps but also irrevocably alter the lives of people across an entire continent. At the heart of the Louisiana Purchase stood a man burdened by both a crown and a headache: Napoleon Bonaparte. In 1803, the French emperor was stretched thin, fighting on multiple fronts in Europe and the Caribbean, while simultaneously struggling to manage his own treasury. As a result, he made a decision that stunned nearly everyone involved. He offered to sell off a third of North America to the very country he had once hoped to prevent from gaining continental power. It also cemented a model of power built on land acquisition, displacement, and development. The West was no longer a mystery. It was a target. And for settlers, speculators, and politicians, it was an open invitation to seize opportunity by uprooting what already existed. For Native American nations, the transformation was catastrophic. The land they had lived on, traded through, fought for, and honored was suddenly owned, not by an invading army, but by a distant government that claimed to have bought it. There were no negotiations, no consent, just a line on a map and a new set of rules. The arrival of American settlers accelerated cycles of violence, forced removals, and cultural devastation. Treaties came and went, reservations were drawn. Bison were slaughtered, languages faded. By the time the dust settled, the Native American presence in the Louisiana Territory had been largely confined, silenced, or erased, though never entirely extinguished. And yet, the legacy of the purchase remains layered. The cities, economies, and infrastructure that emerged from it helped shape the modern United States. The rivers it granted became lifelines. The natural resources it offered fueled industrial growth. The space it opened allowed for innovation, diversity, and reinvention. But the shadow of that deal still lingers. The Louisiana Purchase stands today as a paradox, a bold diplomatic victory and a blueprint for displacement. It's a story of growth and grief, of ambition and amnesia. It made the United States what it is, but it also forced a reckoning that continues to this day. How do you celebrate a land you never truly asked for and can never truly return? Women, of course, have even less of a say. A samurai daughter might be married off at 15, required to master calligraphy, etiquette, needlework, and the fine art of never expressing disappointment out loud. Her job is to bear sons, serve tea, and absolutely never fall in love with the flute teacher. Actual romantic love, the kind with stolen glances and passionate declarations, is generally the domain of poets, theater plays, and tragic ghost stories. If you actually want to experience love in feudal Japan, you'll need to watch a no-drama about two doomed lovers who eventually turn into mist. And if you try to step outside your assigned relationship structure, well, good luck. Adultery can easily lead to exile, disgrace, or even death by sword-related disapproval. The punishment might actually be carried out by your spouse, your lord, or even your in-laws, whoever actually gets there first. Even for samurai, taking a concubine was common, but that didn't exactly make things easier. It just added more people to disappoint silently. So yes, people definitely fell in love secretly, painfully, occasionally with the wrong person, and always at the absolute worst possible time. Because in feudal Japan, love wasn't necessarily forbidden. It was just incredibly, dangerously inconvenient. In feudal Japan, death isn't some distant concept. It's your neighbor, your coworker, your roommate who never actually pays rent, but is always around. You don't plan for retirement. You actually plan for your exit. Because death isn't a tragedy here. It's actually just part of the script. Let's start with the samurai. These honorable warriors walk around with two swords and a very personal death plan. If they lose a battle, seppuku. Insult their honor, seppuku. Spill sake on the daimyo's robe, seppuku, with dramatic background music. And it's not private either. Here's where things get really wild. With a Greek ship relentlessly pursuing her, Artemisia made a decision that historians still debate to this day. She ordered her ship to ram and sink another Persian vessel, one from an allied king, no less. The move was so unexpected that the Greeks, assuming she must be on their side, stopped chasing her. She slipped away untouched. Xerxes, watching from a hilltop, supposedly witnessed this and turned to his aides, exclaiming, "My men have become women, and my women have become men." It was perhaps the highest praise he ever gave a subordinate, especially one who had just sacrificed a friendly ship to save herself. But Artemisia's move wasn't just about survival. It was about strategy, misdirection, and cold-blooded calculation all rolled into one. She read the battlefield in real time and made a split-second decision that saved her ship, her crew, and possibly her own life. It was controversial and brutal, but it worked. While many Persian commanders died that day or fell into disgrace, Artemisia sailed back not as a failure, but as one of the only leaders Xerxes still trusted. The Persian fleet limped back from Salamis, humiliated. Ships were lost, morale was shattered, and the myth of Persian naval invincibility was destroyed. For many commanders, this was the beginning of the end, but for Artemisia, it was a strange kind of triumph. In the middle of a disastrous campaign, she emerged as the one figure of competence, someone who had warned the king, acted decisively, and escaped unscathed. Xerxes took notice. It's public, ceremonial, and performed with the exact same precision as a tea ceremony, but with significantly more internal bleeding. But don't think that peasants are getting a longer life. If you're a farmer and the rice harvest fails, you're starving. If your village can't meet its tax quota, your head might be used to make a very stern point. Drought, plague, bandit raid? Just pick your flavor of sudden demise. And good luck fighting any of it when your most advanced medicine is just warm tea and a very strong belief in herbal optimism. Speaking of bandits, they're very real. They're everywhere. And they definitely don't care that you spent all year growing those daikon radishes. The roads outside of the towns are so incredibly dangerous that people just don't travel unless it's absolutely necessary. The phrase, "maybe we'll visit your cousin next year," actually just means, "I enjoy being alive." If you're a woman, childbirth is pretty much a dice roll. Complications? Too bad. Midwives are helpful, sure, but surgical options are mostly just pray harder and boil another towel. If your husband happens to die in disgrace, you might actually be expected to follow him, not emotionally, but literally with a dagger. And let's not forget nature itself. Earthquakes, floods, tsunamis, famines. Japan is pretty much a disaster artist. Your home could actually be washed away or buried at any time. And the only insurance policy is a well-tied roof and a very deep spiritual acceptance. But perhaps the darkest part is that you're actually expected to accept it all calmly. Wailing in fear or fighting fate is considered completely undignified. A real hero bows right before death, composes a poem, and meets their end like it's just another awkward dinner with your clan. So yes, feudal Japan is beautiful, but mortality is very much just part of the decor.